might get started, and as more people join the call, that's absolutely fine. So first, I'd like to warmly welcome you all here to our event this morning with our strategic HR partners, Adare Human Resource Management, where our colleagues and friends at Adare Human Resource Management are going to provide to us an in-depth analysis of their recent HR Barometer report, which I believe is in its 5th year now this year. And it's a comprehensive analysis of the issues and challenges that organizations are facing at the moment, which I'm sure you'll agree are many and are more unusual over the past 2 years than we've ever seen before. So hopefully this morning will provide a very good opportunity for you to see what's happening out there in the market in terms of HR and employment law, and get some insights into what you can do as HR practitioners to support your teams and your organizations. So just a little bit of housekeeping this morning. If you could ensure that your mics are off for now, and it would be great to see some faces. So if you're happy to flick on your camera, then we'd love to see you as well. It's useful to look at the presentation this morning in speaker view, so for best viewing for yourselves. And I'd encourage you to use the chat box as well. So Derek and Sarah are going to be able to answer some questions throughout the session. So if anything springs to mind, please be sure to pop it into the chat box, and Derek and Sarah will be getting to those questions throughout the course of the morning. Right, so without further ado, I'd like to welcome Derek McKay, who's the Managing Director of Adare Human Resource Management, along with his colleague Sarah Fagan, who's the Consulting Practice Manager and Human Resource and Employment Law Practitioner at Adare. So over to you, Derek.
Brilliant, great. Thanks, Deirdre, and to Vicky and Lisa for a lot of organising going into this morning's session. So look, delighted to present to the Cork Chamber members here today. There's a lot of rich data that we're going to be sharing rising out of our most recent HR Barometer survey. So as Deirdre mentioned, this is the 5th year of our HR Barometer, which is really designed to help benchmark key HR data and metrics, take the time to analyze what they mean for businesses and organizations, and use it hopefully effectively to try and forecast what's key going into the following 12 to 24-month period. So we'll go through the key data today, and we will host the full HR Barometer report on on Linea, our HR platform, and we'll make that available complimentary to Cork Chamber members who are attending here today. So they won't need to scribble down all the different stats and different graphs that we're going to show today. All the information contained in a much more detailed report. But myself, my colleague Sarah, will go through a lot of the key highlights that we've seen coming out of the Barometer, which took place only in the last couple of weeks. The findings are live off the press, and what this means then for organizations looking particularly into next year, and with all the change that is still happening around us. So quite a number of key areas that we're going to go through over the next hour and a half or so. I'll jump very quickly into the whole area of HR priorities. This is an area that every year we look to benchmark to see what are the key HR priorities, usually top 3, top 5 HR priorities for organizations for the upcoming 12 months. And it really does hopefully help focus the mind in terms of what organizations absolutely will need to focus in on. We can't get to everything in a given 12 months. It is about prioritizing the areas that we feel will have the most and the biggest impact from a business perspective. Each time we do the barometer, we look at key and core HR metrics. And I know from my time in-house HR, this is the sort of data that I used to present back to usually the finance director in terms of looking for budget and looking to put forward the business case as to why we need to invest in something, why we need to further explore a particular area, or start to, I suppose, spend money that the finance don't necessarily want us to spend. So in a good way, it gives key external HR metrics from employee turnover to L&D spend, areas that do have a financial cost to it from a business perspective. So we'll touch upon that trajectory in terms of those metrics and what that means for 2022 in particular. Pay and benefits, obviously an absolute key area that all organizations seek to keep their finger on the pulse of in terms of what is happening in the pay and benefits arena. We know there was significant dampening of pay expectations around 2020 and into the earlier part of 2021. We've seen a fundamental change in that now in our most recent HR barometer. And again, I'll show you that trajectory in terms of the findings we have from a barometer. Sarah will then bring us through a number of the key HR strategic areas, from retirement ages, investment in pension, gender pay gap reporting, D&I, all again key areas that we know are on the radar for organizations. So hopefully to give you some insight into what's anticipated going forward in each of those areas. And the whole area of working practices is an area that we introduced into the HR barometer about 18 months ago, given the significant changes in working practices that we were seeing. And we've tracked those again in the barometer that took place in October, and we'll share those with you today and finish up just in terms of some key takeaways for you at 11:30. In terms of just the scope of the barometer, so we have been carrying it out annually over the last 5 years, but this year and going forward, we've committed to carrying it out twice per year, and really on the basis of the pace of change. And that can't be a surprise to people. The basis of actually seeing some of the data changing significantly and the anticipation of some of the information changing significantly over a period of 6 months because of what's happening in the external environment. So the data we're presenting today will have seen some of the shift from our earlier barometer that took place in March of this year. So hopefully that it really does enable you to make informed, timely business decisions moving into 2022. And the timing of this, again, is designed to help, I suppose, inform that thinking for 2022. I absolutely appreciate, again, arising at last week's announcement, there was an element of further uncertainty about the lie of the land, and particularly around working practices. And potentially this is something that organizations will continue to have to manage and run their business against that backdrop. But I suppose the key we'd say is not making a decision is probably the worst decision you'll make in terms of HR terms. So use the data to make an informed decision. And like anything, if for any reason things are changing, it's revisiting your own HR strategy and your HR plans. So one, as was an important aspect for me when we do our HR barometer is positioning it against the backdrop of the changing landscape that we're operating within. We would always say from a HR practitioner's perspective, you really don't want to be stuck in the bubble of your own HR department or even your own organization. And it's understanding what's happening around you and the impact of that on the business and in the sector. So a couple of areas that I just want to kind of bring to the attention that we see as being important against this backdrop of some of these changes. So we're seeing inflation increasing. So October had the highest CPI increase since I think it was early 2007, up to 5.1%. So all of a sudden we're seeing inflation coming in at around 2%. Whilst it isn't the largest of numbers, it is against the backdrop of us being in negative inflation not too long ago. Why is it important today? Well, it is the context of employees and the cost of living and the expectation to say, well, how do they pay for that cost of living? And ultimately, that leads into our discussions around the whole area of pay and benefits and employee expectations around pay. We're seeing the backdrop of employment legislation. That doesn't stop with COVID happening in the background. In fact, some of the areas like the right to disconnect are probably more relevant in terms of the timings in which we find ourselves. So, even over the last, just during 2021, we started the year with the changing of the code of practice on bullying, which, if you haven't yet changed, is a fundamental change to the anti-bullying policies and procedures you should have in place. So that came in earlier during the year. We saw the code of practice come in place in April in terms of the right to disconnect. Again, particularly relevant given the hybrid remote working environment in which we found ourselves back then and still find ourselves now at this moment in time. We saw the code of practice on employment status updated and revised in July of this year. that really, again, that differentiation between a contract for and a contract of service. So again, something that HR practitioners are expected to be aware of and be able to advise their organizations in terms of the engagement of contractors and not sleepwalking into an employment relationship, by default. We've seen other areas change in relation to the minimum wage being announced to come in place in January of this year. We also saw family leave change as well from 2 weeks to 5 weeks. So quite a lot of different pieces of legislation or codes of practice changing around us. And as we move into 2022, we know statutory sick pay, the introduction of statutory sick pay for organizations over a phased basis. I've mentioned minimum wage. We saw the protected disclosures legislation due to be looked at again in 2022, as well as the introduction of the gender pay gap legislation that I know Sarah is going to reference. So again, we could have had the morning session just on employment legislation alone, but it is important, just as I said, to remind people that regardless of what else is going on in terms of priorities within the business, this is one aspect that continues on. Unemployment rates in a very positive way are continuing to fall. We've seen it kind of this time last year above about 6.3% to about 5.2%. So significant drop in unemployment. The relevance here today, I think, will become very clear as we talk about the feedback from organizations in terms of priorities and recruitment and talent acquisition being one of those key priorities. So that war for talent, that challenge to bring in and find the new resources into the organization, proven more and more difficult. So unemployment rates continuing to fall, and we're continuing to see the changes to the various government support schemes as well decrease over time. So that again, we'll see what impact that has in terms of employment rates or unemployment rates. We don't have a huge amount in the barometer at this moment today to talk around COVID-19. We know the impacts we've seen, particularly the barometer over the last 18 months. We've seen it being the #1 priority for organizations in terms of management. This barometer here that we're sharing today is the first time it doesn't feature as a #1 HR priority going into 2022. So that tells us a lot, or certainly raises a lot of questions. One, I hope it's because organizations are getting better and HR practitioners are managing it, managing the health and safety, the communications, the hybrid working, the various different aspects that are there arising out of the challenge for arising out of the pandemic. But equally, I'd be hopeful that organizations are realizing that they do need to put and implement and execute their HR plans, regardless of what's happening in the external environment. So that they do realize that there's a challenge in terms of talent acquisition, that pay and benefits is back on the agenda, and they need to get ahead of those sort of discussions, that they do need to formalize their working practices, be it around hybrid working, remote working, or back to the office, whatever that may be. And actually, as I mentioned, back to the office and hybrid working, it reminds me that the other piece of employment legislation on the right to request remote working due to be enacted maybe this side of Christmas, all depending. So again, another piece of legislation that is high on HR practitioners' agenda. Significant change, employee expectations. A lot of that has come about in terms of where people want to work, how people want to work, and now how much they want to get paid for that work. So the management of employee expectations going forward is going to be front and center for a lot of employers. And we do think that's going to impact on those employee turnover rates, which have been at their lowest over the last 18 months as well. So being at their lowest means, unfortunately, it's going to go in one direction, and how organizations are going to manage or mitigate the increased levels of employee turnover expected in 2022. And then the new world of work. And I suppose hopefully we'll be just dropping the word new, just focusing in on the world of work. So we've tended to shy away from the narrative around future of work because we find people are push it down the line to say it's not something we need to deal with now. We've plenty of other matters that need our attention. But I would see that in terms of the working practices and how organizations are going to land in 2022 in relation to their newer working models. And that will no longer be the newer model, will be their actual model, and how they manage people within that, how they manage their L&D within that, and how they manage employee expectations and communications as well. So a lot there within the changing landscape. And this, for me, then kind of sets the backdrop against the key findings that we're going to share. So I did mention there in the introduction. So what we do, we commission an external agency on our behalf to go out to market and talk to organizations across the country to do this work. So they present back their own independent findings arising out of all the telephone interviews they do with hundreds of organizations across the country and across sectors. So what myself and Sarah have presenting here today are the key priorities on a national basis, but we have got the agency to show us where, from a Cork perspective, if any of those national trends are different on a local basis from a Cork perspective. So it'll be interesting to see if there's any kind of nuances built in there as well. So HR priorities. So when the research agency was talking to organizations, I said in October of this year, and we analysed the findings over the last couple of weeks. What's very clear is that recruitment and talent acquisition and retention are the two key HR priorities going into 2022 for organizations. So we've seen, as I mentioned, from the macro side, that that there's greater unemployment levels are down, and we've seen that expectations on pay will be increasing, and we'll show in a few minutes that employee turnover has been less. So when we start combining those particular facts that we know, it's not a surprise that organizations, as they look into the 2022 year ahead of them, that they see that they're going to face challenges in terms of bringing new people in, hopefully in terms of headcount increases, but equally retaining the people that they have. And I suppose knowing that, the question will arise as well, what plans are organizations going to put in place in terms of their maybe employee value proposition from a talent acquisition perspective, or the retention strategies. And we'll talk about the whole area of working practices and how that factors into one of those retention strategies. Employee health and well-being has continued to fare very strong over the last 18 months of our barometer, which again is one of the positive developments over the last 18 months, that it is kind of seen more now within the DNA of organizations rather than the employee well-being day or employee well-being week that at some stage we all would have been guilty of implementing from a HR perspective, a much more consistent approach to employee health and well-being. The key thing around this is that, next year that needs to remain high on the radar, and the investment in employee health and well-being certainly needs to be maintained going into 2022. And then employee engagement and performance management still featuring as strong priorities on behalf of organizations going into 2022. When we look at the data associated with Cork, we see that the priorities remain the same in terms of the top 5, but in fact, the top 2, recruitment, talent acquisition, retention, are actually coming in even higher within the Cork region as being some of the business challenges. And I'm not saying HR challenges, the business challenges, because if organizations don't have the required number of people to deliver the service, to do the job, it is going to be a challenge for them from a business perspective. That business challenge becomes a HR challenge. So again, resource planning ahead and not waiting for these challenges to hit us will be a key message coming out of today. Some of the other areas that we're seeing outside of the top 5, pay, future of work, addressing COVID-19 challenge, the challenges and culture. So as I said, interesting, addressing COVID-19 challenges was the #1 priority over the last number of our barometers. And it has gone down significantly. Not that the challenges aren't as important to be managed, the health and safety, the communications, but it is, as I said, hopefully that HR practitioners are now getting on with the plans that may have been put on hold or may have stalled a little, arising out of the need to focus on addressing COVID-19 challenges. Just the one point I'll make around culture, and I know not everything can be a priority within an organization, but when I look at this and I think, well, employee well-being, that can really strengthen retention, engagement can really strengthen retention. But the culture piece, that organizations spent so much time over previous years developing the culture, talking about culture, what's our DNA. And I think that as we, I suppose, land on a hybrid, remote, whatever ways of working organizations are landing with, and the evidence shows that there will be a lot more hybrid working in the future, that organizations have to work 2, 3, 4 times harder to even maintain their culture that they had in pre-COVID times. And so whilst I appreciate it's coming in as a low area of focus at the moment in terms of priorities, because people are saying, well, we need to get the right number of people in. I just would caveat it with that we want to make sure that culture, the work and effort that goes in to the culture piece isn't diminished or undervalued, particularly in a much more hybrid and dispersed working world. When we did the survey 6 months ago, we can see that the differences there. As I said, so 6 months ago, addressing COVID-19 was like on par in terms of being the number one challenge, and retention coming in second. So very quickly organizations over that 6-month period, as more businesses have reopened, as there's a bit more confidence in the market, as we're seeing less people on the various different government support schemes, etc., etc. So a number of key drivers bringing about these new priorities. So hopefully there's something in there that resonates with you, that you can bring back to the business to say, well, look, what does this mean for us? This something now we need to start planning for in 2022, and trying to get a head start on the priorities going into next year. The HR metrics piece, as I mentioned earlier on, is an area for me that being able to see the trend over the last number of years and forecast into next year is critically important, really from making the business case known internally. So, and I was actually doing a session yesterday with an organization, and part of their planning was around HR KPIs and the HR dashboard we put in place for them. And they were talking about what their employee turnover is anticipated to be next year. So of course, that's based on a number of factors: what their current employee turnover is, what we're seeing out in the market at the moment, what steps they're taking in terms of retention. But being able to, share some of the benchmark data was very useful for them to understand where they sit overall as well. So just to kind of give you an understanding, as we've measured employee turnover over the last number of years, 2018, 2019, averaging around 15% employee turnover within organizations. So organizations during that period, 1 in 6, 1 in 7 staff were moving on within an organization. As 2020 came about and the impact of COVID, we saw that cut in half. We saw that less than 8% of people would be leaving organizations on a voluntary basis. And then when we again asked the question in March of 2021, it was predicted that that would be quite similar for 2021. So again, we're seeing the mirroring of 2021 as was in 2020. So again, 1 in 6, 1 in 7 people leaving the organization. As we move forward into 2022, we're seeing that it's anticipated it will go up by at least a third. So we're moving back into double digits in relation to expected employee turnover for the year. But interestingly, when we take the data from a Cork perspective, we actually see that going back up closer to the 2018 figure of 15%. So when I see that statistic coupled with the priority in the region being that recruitment and talent acquisition is even seen greater focus and priority in the Cork region than on a national basis, it mirrors some of the concern that there's going to be a greater level of employee turnover in 2022 for organizations within the county. So again, knowing this and in your resource planning, how do you go about doing it? So again, very simple numbers. When I look at sharing this information, I say we're an organization with 100 employees, and we're planning to grow by 20 staff because business is good, hopefully. So we'd have to recruit 20 new people next year, but that's not what we need to recruit. We know we're going to potentially experience 15% employee turnover. So that's about 15 people leaving the business. So all of a sudden, recruiting that 20 people becomes to recruiting 35 people within the business. So that's 35 people new who joined throughout the year, 35 recruitments, 35 inductions, 35 probations, and then bring me back to the culture piece as well. That's nearly a third or quarter of our organization who are new, who don't know our DNA, how we work, you know, what our core values are. So that work in terms of onboarding that 35 new people in a given year will take dedicated HR time, management time, and budget in terms of actually doing it. So one of the areas again, we do, and you'll see it in previous barometers, we measure the cost of replacing an employee. And over the years, that's ranged from about €5,500 up to €14,000 per employee. So it's possible even to put a numerical value on the cost of employee turnover, you know, within business. So we have our first of our polls, interactive polls. So Lisa is going to put up our first poll question here. So for your organization in 2022, if you could just choose one of the initiatives below, which one do you feel would have the biggest positive impact on reducing your own employee turnover? Okay, so 2022, if you pick one of the initiatives below, which would have the biggest positive impact, do you think, on reducing employee turnover in your organization? So we're thinking it could be as high as 15% next year for organizations. If we take action and put into our plans, what could mitigate some of that potential employee turnover? Okay, take another 10 seconds there just to get your answers in. Last 5 seconds, pick one of the areas. Okay, so let's close out there. So at the moment, coming in highest, which is consistent with what we've seen in our recent polls as well around this particular question, is the whole area of increased salaries. So a third of people on the call today felt increased salaries is going to be the number one priority for them. And coming in strongly in second, 1 in 4 organizations saying putting flexible and hybrid working arrangements on a permanent footing. So ironically, those are the results in order 1 and 2 have been the same 1 and 2 we've gotten out of the last couple of sessions and polls we've done in relation to positive impact on employee turnover. So one obviously had that direct cost in relation to salaries. The other is now about providing a level of certainty for employees arising out of their working arrangements. Now, obviously, given the last week's update in relation to the recommendation to work from home unless it's necessary to be in the workplace, I think that has set back a lot of organizations in terms of their plans, their thinking, their planned engagement. So I think that's one aspect that might be frustration for employers, equally from an employee's perspective, providing its uncertainty again. And we can only hope that as early as possible in Q1, that organizations are back being able to make their own decisions as to what's most appropriate for their workforce in terms of a way of working, of course, against the backdrop of the work safety protocols. Okay, so a couple of polls spread out throughout, just again to sense check the thinking. So one of the other areas that we benchmarked in the last few weeks was the whole area of investment in learning and development. And if we take the snapshot over the last number of years, 2017 forward, we get to see that it's ranged from, I suppose, at 2017, just under 5% to a high of last year of closer to 8%. So this percentage is a percentage of your payroll that you would spend on training. So if your payroll bill was €1 million per year, what we're saying, what participants are telling us in 2022, they're going to be spending roughly equivalent to 7% of that, reinvesting in learning and development for their staff. From again, a court data perspective, it was just slightly higher than the 7% and slightly higher than the national average, which is the 6.8% there as well. So similar, but just again, slight higher investment anticipated, which again, hopefully gives you a good benchmark to say, what is the budget we require as an organization to be able to invest in our staff going next year. And hopefully here's some key data to be able to use to reinforce that. One of the other metrics we look is to say as well, on average, for full-time equivalent staff, how many days training are you providing in a given year? And that's averaging out, anticipated as 5 days per year from a national basis, slightly higher from a Cork's perspective, saying that there's slightly higher investment of 6 days per year. So again, if you think of it, you'll see I always pick easy numbers. We have 100 staff, we have 6 days training per full-time equivalent. We're going to be having 600 days training potentially throughout the year. And we know what that cost is going to be, around 7% of our payroll. So it enables you to start putting in place some of the plans around learning and development. These are just some of the very kind of tangible metrics. What we really want to get into is that return on investment, that return on learning, and being able to, I suppose, better demonstrate to the business, why we're investing in this particular area. And of course, we know the whole area of learning, development, succession planning, that is a key enabler for retention. We go back to our earlier slides where we're saying we could be losing 1 in 6 staff next year. So how do we retain some of them? And certainly a focus on L&D is one of those areas. We did ask the question about, have you done anything innovative in terms of training over the last 6 months? What came through is that 1 in 4 organizations have said, look, we've taken the opportunity to bring our learning and development online, which, as you can imagine, probably does bring about a certain amount of cost savings as well, can enable a lot better reporting and streamlining of it as well. So there's a couple of things there, more information within the overall HR Barometer report that we make available to everybody. So hopefully some good stats in there. Other stats that we benchmarked earlier during the year, things like absence rates and all that is already benchmarked. So that information is available for previous iterations of the barometer. And the final couple of metrics that we look at, we looked and we asked the organization, are you planning to increase headcount in 2022? So about 6 in 10 organizations said they are. So again, that's reinforcing our earlier slides that organizations are saying we may have a pain point in terms of talent acquisition, that if we're going to be growing our headcount next year, we're going to have to work harder to acquire that talent. And the average increase in headcount is around 12%, so double-digit headcount. And so again, all the factors that we see gets put into the resource planning and the HR strategy now as organizations are actually looking at it. The other metric we benchmark year on year is around HR headcount. So the numbers of full-time equivalent HR staff for the number of full-time equivalent staff within the organization. So we do it as a ratio, and we don't include payroll within that, no disrespect to payroll people. We just look at what we classify as core HR deliverables. So over the last number of years, what we've seen is that ratio range from, for every 51 staff, there was 1 full-time equivalent, to earlier in 2019, it was closer to every 69 staff, there was 1 HR equivalent person. So 2021's data more aligned to 2019, but it is reinforced by organizations saying the majority, 2/3, are not planning to increase their HR headcount in 2022. And I think with that brings about the question is, well, there's going to be increased overall headcount. There's going to be an anticipated increase in employee turnover, yet there's not going to be an increase in the number of HR staff to support and drive some of those initiatives. So I will have a poll question on that in terms of knowing that, how what actions can HR take to more effectively manage it. And I've just taken 3 stats here, and my colleague Sarah is going to join us based on these 3 particular statistics. So we know that 62%, around 6 in 10 organizations are planning to increase the number of staff going forward, and that's going to be double-digit growth. And we know that 2/3 of organizations have said their priority is on talent acquisition going into next year. So I know Sarah's been talking with a lot of our clients. She's been talking with a number of recruiters and headhunters, really just to get a better insight into what actions organizations can take. So I think the first thing we said we talked with Sarah would be about the top 3 actions employers potentially could or should take based on the statistics arising up from our HR barometer.
Thanks, Derek. Well, there's no doubt that there's, a number of challenges within the recruitment market at the moment, and what we've been hearing on the ground in terms of agencies, recruiters, the areas of focus have to be, first one has to be the speed of the process. What we've seen is that there's a lot of great talent out there, but ultimately all other processes are moving extremely quickly. So if any employer is looking to retain or recruit an individual, they need to ensure that their process is keeping up with the market challenges at the moment. The second area to look at is obviously the employee value proposition, and that's really important when you're trying to attract really good talent to your organization. So considering your brand, what is not only the total reward, but like what is your approach to attracting talent to your organization? How do you deal with it in terms of engagement, in terms of the other benefits that are available? And the very third bullet point in relation to, I suppose, priorities when it comes to recruitment is to understand that, you're not necessarily going to get a candidate that will meet all the requirements, nor should you necessarily be looking for a candidate that can meet and tick every single box in relation to what you're trying to attract and the role that you're trying to fill. It's really important with any sort of talent acquisition that there is an upskilling and performance management, a stretch that will be applied to the role. So what we're saying to organizations and employers is that if you have a candidate that meets 70% of the bill, then ultimately that is a really good candidate. If they can do everything, the likelihood is that you may not retain them for as long as you need. So it's really important that you're aware of that to ensure that there is an upskilling provision and there will be that constant stretch.
Yeah, and look, we say it, sure, we all want not only the perfect candidates of the job description, but we want them to be able to do other stuff as well that isn't even in the job description, and we want to pay potentially a little bit below market rate in order even to attract that, and that's not the market within which we know we're operating within, certainly the strength of the candidate market. The other thing I know you were talking to organizations about was the managing or so understanding the employee expectations as well, particularly obviously around hybrid working.
Yeah, really important that you're very transparent and direct with all prospective candidates in relation to expectations, especially because of the way the environment is in the recruitment market. A lot of candidates are looking for potentially full remote application to their roles, and that may not necessarily be something your organization can provide. So being clear from the get-go in terms of expectations, whether it's hybrid, blended types of work practices, is really important, just to ensure that you're on the same page from the get-go and that you're able to then retain the talent on the basis of that.
Yeah. And I think the final bit, I know again from all the discussions, because it's of interest to most organizations, is how candidates even view the recruitment practices at the moment, in terms of, I suppose, traditionally we'd be all used to saying we put an advert out and candidates would flock and we were able to have the pick of the bunch, but how candidates operate within the job market is again different than it was even 12 months ago.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, it goes back again to the speed of the process, and because it's an employee's market at the moment, employees want to know that they can attend a virtual interview, especially currently because of the restrictions, and they want to understand the length of the process. Gone are the days where it might drag out for 3 to 4 weeks or even longer. What you need to have is a really quick turnaround. And to be honest, the best piece of advice in that respect is to get ahead of the curve, start working in your workforce plans so that you're not just reacting to natural attrition or any terminations that result or arise, that you are putting in a strategic approach to workforce planning to ensure that you have constant talent at your disposal and that you're able to get the really great candidates that will align to your culture, your vision.
Yeah, great. So there's a lot, as I said, just from talking with organizations who they themselves have shared that part of their challenge at the moment and into next year is the recruitment and talent. It's sort of useful to be able to share some of that feedback with attendees today. Thanks, Darren. Your slides will be coming up in a few minutes now.
Okay.
I think the other thing as well, I know from conversations with Sarah, people were talking about the effectiveness or lack of effectiveness of the counter offer, and that at best it retains people for another few months at a higher cost within the organizations. But statistics tell us most of those people the counter offer back in the market within 6 months anyway. And I think the question arises as well, if there was going to be additional monies paid to keep someone, would they not have been paid that in the first place as part of their normal reward? So look, that will bring us on to the whole area. Well, actually, sorry, quick poll question here. This question is one I'm interested in, given the statistics, whereby we're seeing that in the absence of an increase to HR headcount, what actions can HR take to deliver more? So it's a single choice question, picking only one, picking your favorite child. Which one in terms of can give you better, the ability to deliver more with the same level of HR resources going into 2022? Better streamlined processes, greater investment in technology, greater delegation and potentially ownership from people or the line managers, or outsourcing non-core HR activities. Okay, so another 10 seconds. Which of these, picking one only, will enable you think, to deliver more? The last few seconds. Okay, streamlined processes, technology, delegation to managers, or outsourcing. Okay, last 5 seconds there. Okay, we'll close that now and let's see in terms of the information. So what we're seeing is that the delegation to people line managers, and I think that's the old chestnut from a HR perspective, that, if when line managers saying, well, that's a HR thing, go talk to HR, when HR are going, well, you need to talk to your line manager about that. So that investment in line managers to become better people managers, better skilled and equipped. And I think, again, as we move and continually move into this hybrid world, that can be more difficult. So even the increased investment for people line managers to have the tools and the experience to be able to do that. We know, particularly recruitment technology and HR technology, that can lend to greater efficiencies to take out the administration element. And I would always caveat that with any investment technology and systems can only be done effectively if you have streamlined HR processes there. So again, just to get people thinking about some of the ways which they might need to look at in terms of their planning for next year, and what they might need to do differently in 2022 than they did in 2021. Okay, so I'm going to look at now is the whole area of pay and benefits, because again, it's something that is front and center for organizations at the moment and very topical. So as I mentioned, we've seen the narrative in the wider market, I suppose, reflective of discussions around inflation, cost of living increases. So again, the cost of living wage being gone up, I think it was 50 cents earlier this year, minimum wage increasing again, from January. So there's a number, I suppose, of those external factors that are leading into this discussion as well. So again, I've taken the snapshot over the last few years just to show you two things: the average percentage pay increase and the percentage of organizations who are doing that pay increase. So if we look over the years, so when we go back to 2019, we saw about half of organizations, as they were going into 2019, anticipated they'd be having a pay increase, and that pay increase being about 4%. As we move forward into 2020 and with the pandemic, not surprisingly, we saw a significant decrease in the number of organizations. Only 1 in 5, so 22% of organizations would have been planning a pay increase in 2020, and that being a smaller pay increase of 3%. So a huge dampening around pay expectations in 2020. And we even see then of that 22%, that's driven by a number of sectors. who remain buoyant and some of them open during the pandemic. As we moved then forward into earlier this year and March of this year, we saw the level of pay of 3% remain similar. But we saw an increase in the number of organizations. So 41% of organizations in March of this year, when asked the question in 2021, would you or have you done a pay increase? And 41% of organizations saying we either have or we're planning to do it. And that pay increase was going to be 3%. So, certainly there hadn't been the narrative around pay was still very conservative back earlier this year. And then we fast forward some 6 months and we've seen two things happen. We've seen the number of organizations who have or are planning a pay increase in 2021 increasing significantly to 3/4, 3 and 4 organizations planning, and that rate of pay increase going up closer to 2019 levels, so at 3.9%. So there's certainly a feeling from organizations surveyed that pay is firmly back on the agenda, and that change and shift has happened over the last 6 months. We fast forward into 2022 and ask the question as well, and what we see there is a similar enough percentage, about 3.7%, and at the moment already 59% of organizations, 6 in 10 organizations are already anticipating a pay increase to be implemented next year. So certainly we can see a significant change from really the first, the 18 months of 2020 into mid 2021. So again, something to factor in to the HR planning. The reasons for salary increase, some organizations then, well, look, we're profitable, so we can afford to do it. And the affordability is there, so we don't have to look at the inability to pay clause. Some organizations are looking at changing workplace practices, so it's contingent on that. A small number, single digits, saying it's not linked to anything in particular. We have a number of organizations that have sectoral agreements and things like that in place, so that's already happening by default. And we asked the question as well, and not just around salary, we asked around bonuses. And what we've seen is that about half of organizations in 2021 are saying that they will be planning on paying a bonus, or they have, or planning to pay a bonus. So 1 in 2 organizations. Slightly increases when we look specifically at the Cork region. And it shows that, again, just 56% of organizations, slightly above 1 in 2, are planning bonuses for this year. And we asked the question as to, well, on what basis do you pay bonus? Some are saying, well, look, organizations performing well, so we're hitting our targets. Some saying, well, 1 in 10 saying, well, actually, we want to reward staff for the work during 2021 and staying with us. 1 in 3 organizations roughly saying it's performance related, which I think is a healthy way. 1 in 3 saying it's not related to performance, but nearly the 63% saying it is, and that's the healthy percentage, that there is a performance related element to bonus, and a very small percentage saying, look, we're going to pay it because the difficult times that we find ourselves in, and no doubt they're looking forward down the line to see, well, if we start looking at retention, how do we manage this? Interestingly, from a Cork perspective, we're seeing that nearly half of the organizations there say actually we're going to be paying for bonus, not necessarily related directly to individual performance of staff. So again, something to consider and think about as to when you're discussing internally the whole aspects of bonus, pay, and get it on the agenda. For pay and benefits, we always say it's get ahead of those discussions internally before it's too late and the questions start arising. Okay. Sarah, I'll pass over to you.
Great, thanks, Derek. So we also obviously wanted to look at the key strategic HR areas, and that has produced some results that have aligned to previous Barometer surveys, but obviously there's nuances in relation to the current environment that we're operating in. In terms of retirement and pensions, we sought to understand what are organizations doing at this current moment in time. And ultimately, if we consider that there currently doesn't exist a statutory mandatory retirement age, But when the government did increase the state pension age from 65 to 66, with plans obviously to further increase it over the years, it did give organizations cause to pause and reflect on their current practices and procedures that they were applying. And even in a recent the Pension Commission survey, there was a recommendation made that organizations shouldn't be allowed to impose mandatory retirements until a person has reached the state pension age. Now, notwithstanding that, 12% of organizations, so a very low number, just over 1 in 10, don't actually have a retirement age set out in their organization policy procedure or custom and practice. And I suppose this is sort of aligned to, the previous surveys that we have done, in that organizations have really sought to, maintain the current practices. Even with 93% of organizations outlining in the most recent Barometer survey that they have no plans to change the retirement age. Now, the difficulty with this is that we have seen, 64% of organizations have a retirement age of 65 years of age. And while they're maintaining the status quo, what has been in place for a number of years, it could lead to challenges in terms of WRC employment equality claims. We've definitely seen an increase in employment equality claims based on age discrimination moving through the WRC and the Labour Court. And more recently, in the last year and a half, there's been a number of successful challenges made to or against organizations where they sought to continue and maintain that mandatory retirement age. And in that respect, what a lot of organizations that we're speaking to are looking to do is ensure that they're applying objective justifications, obviously in pursuit of the legitimate aim, which is enshrined in the equality provisions legislation, but they're doing it from a strategic approach, because ultimately, as you know, there are limits under the codes of practice as to how you can legitimately refuse the imposition of a mandatory retirement age. It's not necessarily sufficient enough to say, well, we have a policy in place, we have a contractual clause in place, because what the adjudicators are looking to establish is whether or not that objective justification legitimately applies, and if it's in pursuit of a legitimate aim. So it is looking at succession planning, it is looking at intergenerational fairness and so forth. What we've seen with organizations is that there are very low numbers in terms of those that are willing or have actually changed the retirement ages to align to the state pension age. Now, obviously, in January of this year, the government took the decision that they wouldn't increase the current state pension age from 66 to 67, and it's gone back to the Pension Commission to understand, what they need to basically lay out in terms of the employment relationship in that respect. And in that regard, what we've seen is that from a pension perspective, there's been a slight drop in terms of employer pension, occupational pension schemes being in place, with 66% of organizations, still high, but it was a drop from 71% in 2020, that are contributing to employee pensions. Whether or not the government's decision to pause the increase of the state pension age this past year might have impacted on that, there is the potential of it. But in terms of pension contributions, what we're seeing is that for the most recent survey, the average pension contribution is coming in at 4.8%. Now, in comparison to our 2020 survey, this is a drop where it was at 6% as the average pension contribution. But, the reality is that 4.8% is more aligned to our survey results from 2018 and 2019. So going into 2022, organizations, if they're looking at their employee value proposition, if they're looking at their total reward, need to, I suppose, understand what the market is doing. And currently, what is planned is that it's a 4.8% average pension contribution. Now, in terms of gender pay gap, I think we've seen, quite an amount of movement in terms of diversity and inclusion, and the practices and procedures that are being put in place by organizations. What we know is that the current national average for gender pay gap is at 14.4%. 14.4%. This is more or less aligned to the European average. But what is concerning is in relation to the figures of 1 in 10 organizations actually having or recording the gender pay gap. Now, while it's 1 in 10 and it's quite low, and that is a drop from 2020, where we saw 3 in 10 organizations currently recording their gender pay gap, 69% of those organizations believe that their gender pay gap is in line with the national average. So they believe that it is in line with the 14.4%. But of the organizations that are recording the gender pay gap, 1 in 10 organizations have introduced new initiatives to help improve the gender balance. Now, again, it's quite a low figure. It could be the current environment that we're operating from, but we would certainly expect to see this increase on the basis of the Gender Pay Gap Information Act coming or being signed into law in July of this year, with the expectation that larger organizations, so those organizations with 250 employees or more, having to actually report on their gender pay gap. And once that commences, I would anticipate a lot more organizations introducing both initiatives in relation to diversity and inclusion, but also ensuring that they are recording their gender pay gap, as will be the legal requirement. What was interesting and what we found, over the number of years, the demographics of workforces has significantly changed. And with those changes and the diversity that comes in workplaces these days, that presents challenges, but there are so many beneficial aspects to having a diverse workforce. So organizations that have initiatives in place that are promoting both the gender pay balance as well as diversity, inclusion, and equality will be presented with those benefits as their workforce changes in the coming years. But in terms of having diversity and inclusion procedures in place, which is what you would expect, I suppose, at the very minimum, and what a lot of our clients are introducing, only 6 out of 10 organizations actually had a procedure in place. And in terms of delivering training on that procedure, that fell significantly to 3 in 10 organizations actually implementing training on diversity and inclusion this past year. Now, there is an increase when we asked the participants of the survey whether or not they intended to introduce the kind of training that would align with diversity and inclusion policies and procedures, and that is increasing to 59%. So almost 6 in 10 organizations that intend to implement training on diversity and inclusion in 2022. So in terms of the organizations that have introduced new initiatives that do improve the gender balance, what we've seen is that there were initiatives carry out recruitment drives to gather the gender data that's obviously going to be required, anticipated in early 2022 when organizations will have to report on that. A lot of organizations are also looking to implement campaigns that raise awareness on gender and diversity and inclusion. And for some organizations, they've introduced 50-50 workforce planning. So if we consider, again, even the top priorities that Derek went through in terms of 2022, with retention, recruitment, talent acquisition being in those categories of top priorities, implementing a workforce plan that has a leaning towards gender balance and the promotion of that is obviously something that will, sort of create or add to your employee value proposition in terms of your recruitment strategies and in terms of your retention strategies. So all of these initiatives should be explored as we move forward into 2022. Now, again, as outlined in the priorities that Derek went through, performance management, I believe, was on number 5 on the list in terms of priorities. And what we have seen is obviously 65% of organizations in 2020 having a formal performance management process in place, and that increased to 70% in 2021. Given the current restrictions in terms of remote working that are in place, obviously the traditional face-to-face end-of-year appraisals are going to have to change. And I would think in terms of that increase from 2020 to 2021, while it was only by an increase of 5%, I do think it was reflective of the remote working sort of environment or the hybrid working that took place over the last year. And obviously, in terms of having performance management in place, it adds to employee engagement. It means that you're setting clear expectations and being very transparent in relation to what is required from the role, but it also allows you to manage employees. And 73% of organizations currently believe from our Barometer survey that their performance management process is either effective or very effective. And that's fantastic to hear. What we would sort of outline and what we've seen in terms of organizations is that what was fit for purpose prior to COVID, even though I have a reluctance in even mentioning this, but what was fit for purpose back then may not necessarily be fit for purpose as we work, with the current restrictions, or as you introduce different working practices or blended or hybrid working models. So, it's great that 7 in 10 organizations are of the belief that their performance management structure and process is very effective. But I think understanding what may have to change in the future to align to any changes in working practices or in workforce models will allow you to adapt your performance management process, in a means that suits the environment in which you're working. And that's really important, because I think if we've learned nothing else in the past year and a half is that, you have to be agile, and businesses have shown that and demonstrated that, consistently over the last 18 months. But being agile at a strategic level and in terms of your business and how it's operating means that you also need to have consideration for agility within the structures that are in place when it comes to performance management, especially as we, I suppose, don't know currently when the restrictions will lift. So it's just having that frame of mind in terms of being open to understanding if there are any changing needs when it comes to performance management. So Lisa, we're just going to go to our third poll question, if you don't mind putting it up. What we really want to understand is that if you are implementing one initiative in 2022, which would have the most impact on your performance management process being even more effective, which one would you choose? So whether it's trained managers, streamlined process, clearer ratings, better employee engagement, financial benefit links, or organizational strategy links. It's just important to kind of get a picture of the landscape currently. So we'll just leave that open for another 10 seconds. Okay, Lisa, you might share the results with us there. So that's really interesting. So better trained managers and better employee engagement in the process is coming in at joint first at 40% of participants saying that that is the one initiative that they would introduce. And in terms of these results, they're actually quite similar to the national survey in terms of the information that we gathered from our own event previously in relation to this. And what we've seen is that as we move into, hybrid work practices, there is a continuous need for, first of all, to focus on employee engagement. We know that it's a priority in 2022, but also ensuring that your managers are adept at dealing with, the changes to processes that come with changes to work models. So upskilling managers has come in previously as a number one sort of initiative that would better improve that process. So thanks for that, Lisa. So just moving on now then into working practices. And it was really important that we looked at this area, especially in the current environment, and to see what has changed over the last 6 months. In that respect, we asked participants of the survey, what were your challenges? Like what are organizations' challenges right now? 1 in 8 organizations have faced challenges in relation to redundancies. Not entirely surprising, although personally I thought that it might be a little bit higher on the basis of, the changes with the COVID Act, removing the suspension, on employees' rights who are on layoff for a short time to claim notice of redundancy, but also the difficulties that have been experienced by organizations in the last 18 months. We do anticipate this increasing, and certainly 1 in 8 is low, and it's fantastic that there's been very few challenges in relation to that. But when it comes to moving into 2022, organizations are making more difficult decisions when it comes to restructuring and reorganization. And again, it aligns with the agility that's being consistently demonstrated by organizations to ensure that they have, the correct workforce with the correct skills and so forth in place to move with the changing agility of strategic objectives. But for the moment, it is actually quite low. Then we also sought to understand in relation to remote working requests, what were the issues or were there any challenges that arose? Only 12% of organizations felt that it was a challenge where employees were requesting full remote working, as in 5 days per week. Now, in reality, I think, with the government's national strategy on remote working and the fact that the legislation has still to come into place, that could lend itself to that type of result whereby employees aren't necessarily making those requests just yet, because as well with the current restrictions, the majority of organizations or businesses have had to go back to full remote working, unless of course it's necessary to attend in person. But I think it's representative of where we are currently in the COVID environment, that only 12% of organizations found that there was challenges with that. In terms of agreeing a work model with management and with employees, again, only 14% of organizations found that it was a challenge to agree a working model with management, and it was slightly higher at 16% challenges being faced by organizations who were trying to agree a working model with employees. Again, I think this is really reflective of where we are in the current environment, on the basis that a lot of organizations have been putting off making decisions in relation to permanent changes to their working model. We have worked with a number of organizations and our clients currently who have taken that step and have engaged with employees and with management in relation to that. And for the most part, they have been fully engaged when you're talking about hybrid work models, something which is obviously to the benefit of both the employees as well as the organizations. But nonetheless, almost just over 1 in 10 for both, dealing with the management and employees have experienced challenges. And in that respect, you would like to think that through further communication and transparency in relation to how decisions are being made and making informed decisions would sort of alleviate or mitigate the risks that might be associated with that particular challenge. We also sought to understand if organizations had challenges when it came to employees or management experiencing social anxiety or mental health issues amongst employees caused by a return to the workplace. Again, quite a low figure. It was almost 2 in 10, 19% that said that they did experience challenges. In that respect, if we consider that the government restrictions technically had been removed on October 22nd, and then there was a cautious approach to the return to work, and since then we have gone back into working remotely, that could as well explain those figures. But for certain organizations, there have been continuous, and no doubt in terms of health and well-being, it has been a huge priority and will continue to be. But ultimately, organizations need to be looking to address those situations, ensuring that they are providing the correct supports to employees, ensuring that when we do get to the point where hopefully the government, hopefully in Q1, will say that they're lifting the restrictions and we can continue back to returning to the office, that you're being very clear on what is in place in terms of the work safety protocols, the mitigation measures that you've taken as a business to ensure the health, safety and welfare of all employees. And just being very clear with the employees what the expectations are in terms of returning to the workplace. It's also important that you are listening to any concerns that are being raised by employees in relation to, any mental health concerns that they may have in anticipating returning to the workplace. They could be valid, but they could be something that could be, I suppose, appeased in terms of having that conversation and that two-way sort of communications in relation to that. Then we also asked organization, were they still experiencing challenges with childcare? 80% of organizations said that they weren't. And, again, I think it's because over the last 18 months, a lot of employees and organizations have come to sort of an agreement or an approach in terms of dealing with any childcare issues that have arisen. Obviously, as well, in terms of the schools being open has assisted with that. But still, 2 in 10 organizations have found it challenging. And when we looked at specific sectors in relation to this particular question, it actually did rise from 20% to almost 67%, I believe, in the food processing sector, as well as an increase in the financial insurance sectors, where there continues to be issues or challenges relating to childcare for employees. And I suppose in that respect, obviously, it's important that you're very clear on what supports are available, that you're as flexible as you can, but it always has to be balanced with the needs of the organization or the business. And, that is sort of the highlight in relation to that. The final thing that we looked at when it came to working practices and the challenges faced by organizations was the health and safety grounds in terms of returning, the reluctance in returning to the workplace. And again, this was just over 2 in 10 organizations who face challenges in relation to that. What we've seen with the work safety protocols is, a number of amendments and changes. Now, they've been quite minor in relation to the changes that they implemented in the protocols, with the most recent ones just a couple of months ago. But obviously, ensuring that you have in place your COVID-19 response plan, your suspected case response plan, you have your isolation room, you have, you're asking employees, in particular when we do return to work, to fill out the return to work form, and that all, lead worker representatives have been trained, as well as re-inducting employees in relation to training that is fits under or falls under the work safety protocols, because at the end of the day, any changes in circumstances when it comes to the Health and Safety Act means that you need to consistently review your risk assessments, update your safety statements. So being very transparent in your communications with employees to kind of advise that you have put those processes in place and policies in place, and sort of pointing them to those resources may alleviate some of those concerns. But certainly it is still quite low in terms of the challenges that have presented when we surveyed our participants most recently. So with that, I might just hand back over to Derek if there's any questions that were included in the chat box. Derek? So I'm going to take it that it's a technical issue in relation to Derek rejoining the session. We might just look, Deirdre, at any questions that have come in, or do you have any questions yourself in relation to what was presented this morning?
Sure, Sarah. There's just one question in there from Neov. Any advice on how to attract talent when companies from Dublin are offering higher salaries with remote working? That's, I think, a big challenge.
Yeah, and look, I think that's a challenge, in a sense that has always presented itself in terms of the benchmark salaries and the average relating to, your location. But I think in terms of remote working, I think the first thing is ensuring that you two are considering your working practices that will apply, whether it's hybrid working, etc. Because remember, your employee value proposition as an organization, as a business, is extremely important. And that's what will attract your talent. So even though there may be slightly higher salaries in Dublin, all organizations in Cork and businesses in Cork have an opportunity to really strengthen their employee value proposition and looking at the total reward package, be it financial and non-financial, to ensure that their branding is front and center when it comes to what's on offer and attracting the great talent that is there in Cork.
Thanks, Sarah. Something that actually struck me was when Derek was taking us through the top 5 priorities, and something that we're hearing an awful lot from our own members is around that recruitment and talent acquisition piece. So I'm not surprised it was number 1, and then retention coming in at a second. But culture, I suppose, as you mentioned, is intrinsically linked to that. And I heard a comment recently, about how can you differentiate your culture, which was potentially part of your acquisition and recruitment strategy. Now that people are working remotely, and are you seeing any good practices there across any of the companies that you're working with? How can they stand out, I suppose, from others when people are at home?
Yeah, I think the key is that this is your business or your organization's DNA, and it should be completely separate and distinct from any other organization. But it's highly relevant to ensure that you're consistently embedding it and enhancing those values that you work towards. What we've seen from a culture perspective is organizations focusing in actually on the employee value proposition, focusing in on their branding, how they engage with employees that work for them is really important. And you have to be very transparent and direct in relation to that to ensure that, any prospective candidates are aware, well, they're a good company to work for, they're from the get-go when it's at the recruitment stage, that every dealings they have with you, they really get a good experience from that. But I think from a HR strategic point of view, when you're looking at culture, you do need to look at your employee value proposition, employee engagement, even your performance management, to ensure that they're all representative of the values or the pillars that is your own culture, and that it comes across quite clearly, both to your current employees and any prospective candidates.
Great, thank you. I think we could probably open it to the floor as well, if there's anybody there today who might like to pose a question directly to Sarah or to Derek.
I'd like to pose a question if possible there.
Great, thanks, Joe. Do you want to just let us know maybe who you are and what company you're representing today as well? That'd be useful.
No problem at all. My name is Joe Kennedy. I'm General Manager of Maldron Shandon Hotel in Cork. I'm in the hospitality business for now 32 years, and I'm also involved with the Irish Hotel Federation Cork branch. But I know Derek from a couple of webinars and the IHF. But Derek, since our last conversation, a lot of water has passed under the bridge from the hospitality side of it, and there's more to come. Yeah. What's your advice to our sector, or us as an industry? I get it on the call this morning. There's lots of people in the same frame of mind around recruitment and retention, but it's the number one thing for our industry. Are we making ground, Derek, do you think?
I think, unfortunately, it is going to remain one of the biggest challenges. Like, we know that as a number of things happened at the time, that a number of people left the sector to take up jobs in other sectors. We know a number of people left the country as well and haven't returned, and we've seen unemployment rates, decrease. So I think certainly the focus, Joe, is about retaining the staff that you have, to make sure, first and foremost, that it doesn't become a double challenge, that you're trying to bring new people in as well as replace people. And I know from our engagements with yourselves, that great focus in on the well-being piece and the engagement piece was front and center of what hospitality was endeavoring to do, because the whole sector was one of the sectors that did get hit significantly. I'm hoping that, I suppose, as things remain, that kind of element of kind of job security and people seeing their future still within hospitality is key, and that will come down a lot to the communications and leading out, as you do with the communications internally, to say sometimes the communication update is we don't have an update, because obviously you're being guided by public health advices and all the changing landscape that's around you, but never to underestimate the value of that communication piece. And then final part would be going back to Sarah's piece about how can, from an employee value proposition, ensure that people do see the work, the roles, the things that you have available within the sector as being attractive for them to form their careers with you.
Thanks, Derek. Actually, it was very informative this morning. There are just a couple of, I just, even for our industry, there a lot of it relates to it there around the certain parameters and the percentages, because we see the same in our own type of industry. But well done. Thanks for the webinar this morning, guys, and the chamber. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Joe. We probably have time for one more, guys, if there's anybody else there on the call who would like to ask something specific or general. On mute. So right, I think so that probably brings us close to the end. If there's any concluding remarks from yourself, Derek or Sarah, I know that you wanted to you'll follow up. Yeah, great. Yeah.
So yeah, just kind of final couple of pieces, I suppose, that taken away. There's a lot of content in there, and it's really supposed to help inform the discussion, some from what the priorities organizations are seeing through to some of those benchmark metrics to help make informed decisions. The pay pressures that will be seen and felt the remainder of this year into next year, and the key HR strategic areas that are omnipresent, that they're still there to be managed, and I suppose greater investment in areas hopefully around D&I does strengthen the employee value proposition and hopefully the availability of key talent within the organization as well, and they're not taking our eyes off the whole area of working practices and leading out on that being potentially a key enabler of retention going forward. I appreciate not every role, not every organization can facilitate changing of practices, but certainly where you can, it's something that should absolutely be explored. And as I mentioned, that we've housed the full HR Barometer report on our HR Linea platform. So if people are interested in having that available to them, we'll liaise with Deirdre and the team of making the full Barometer report available. And as always, look, if a question arises out of any statistics, just link in. We'd love to talk to you, get under the bonnet of them and share more information if there's something of interest there to you. And as Deirdre mentioned at the outset, look, we're delighted that we're working with the Cork Chamber as strategic HR partner. So if there's any aspects of HR and employment law supports that you do require, by all means, do link in with us, and we'd be delighted to support you in that area. Great, thanks Deirdre for everything.
Great, thanks Derek, that's fantastic. So as mentioned, we'll follow up with you all after this event with the information that Derek has just given. And also just to mention, you will see through our comms over the coming weeks and months, and you probably have seen recently as well, that Adare Human Resource Management are continuously sharing really solid, useful information and insights through our weekly newsletter, and also through our Chamberlink magazine and through our communication channels. So if you spot anything through any of those communication channels that sparks a thought or a question, at any point you can contact Sarah or Derek or indeed myself to make a connection there for you as well, and we'd be very, very happy to point you in the right direction and offer you as much support as we possibly can over the coming weeks and months and years indeed. So thanks everybody for your time today. It was great to have you on the call, and keep an eye on our communications as mentioned for upcoming events and information. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.